Okay, let's unpack this. What if I told you that in today's world, before armies move, before deals get struck, even before, major political shifts happen, there's this other battle,
Hmm.
one that absolutely has to be won first. And it's not fought with weapons or money, but with ideas, perceptions, information.
Narrative battle.
Exactly, the battle for the narrative. That's one of the really powerful, maybe even unsettling insights waiting for us in the source material for this deep dive. Welcome to the Deep Dive, your dedicated guide through, well, the flood of information out there. Our mission? It's pretty clear. You bring us the articles, the interviews, the research, basically, your personal stack of sources, and we roll up our sleeves.
We dive deep into that material.
Yeah, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, and help you make sense of complex topics quickly, but, thoroughly. We're here to help you cut through the noise and get straight to what really matters.
And for this particular deep dive, the source material you've shared with us is really fascinating. It's an interview published on Shabait, conducted by Sabrina with Mr. Larmbert Ebitu.
Right.
Now, Mr. Ebitu is a political affairs analyst, and he specializes in African geopolitical dynamics, Pan-African issues. He's based in Uganda, brings a lot of experience.
Yeah.
He's been featured on platforms like RT, published widely in Ugandan media, contributes analyses to Africa Interest Media.
Got it.
And this specific conversation you provided, it followed his presentation actually, at the ICES 2025 conference.
Okay, so the core subject we're really immersing ourselves in today, seen through the specific lens of Mr. Ebitu's analysis in this interview, is Africa's really dynamic and, let's face it, complex role within this shifting landscape of global alliances.
Mm-hmm.
It's about grappling with some absolutely fundamental questions, isn't it? Around self-reliance, true sovereignty, and how the continent sort of navigates its place in a world that's becoming, well, increasingly multipolar.
Yeah, definitely. Where power isn't just held by one or two major players anymore. It's much more distributed among multiple nations, different blocks.
Exactly.
So, yeah, we're going to journey through this interview kind of point by point, starting with his reflections on the ICES 2025 conference itself, like what made it stand out for him? What value did he see in actually gathering?
Okay.
Then we'll dive into the heart of his argument. This tackles the perceived options Africa faces when engaging with external global powers. And he has a really compelling case for the absolute necessity of building robust internal strength first.
Right, that internal focus.
Yeah. And we'll explore his perspective on Pan-Africanism, African unity, a topic he's clearly very active on. And then, like you mentioned at the start, really dig into that powerful concept he introduced, narrative warfare, and the absolutely critical role media plays in, well, global dynamics today.
Our goal, as always, is to deliver this straight from the source material you provided, give you a clear, sort of digestible understanding of these really intricate ideas. We'll surface the key insights, maybe uncover some surprising angles, and make sure you walk away feeling more informed, perhaps with a new way of looking at global affairs, without feeling, completely overwhelmed by it all.
Hopefully, yeah.
All right, let's jump right into the first section then. The value of gathering insights from the ICES 2025 conference. So the interview kicks off by asking Mr. Ebitu for his overall impression of the conference he just attended. What was his, immediate reaction?
Well, he opened by describing the experience as amazing. And it didn't sound like he was just being polite, He really stressed the sheer volume and quality of information that was available there. He said there was a lot to be shared and learned.
Okay.
And he specifically highlighted the presentations he saw from people from Eritrea, other countries too. He called them extremely informative. So it suggests he found the actual content, the substance, to be really high standard, genuinely enriching.
That definitely sets a positive tone for the substance. But then he goes on, doesn't he, to talk about the broader significance of events like ICES 2025.
Yeah.
It feels like it was more than just sitting through talks for him.
Oh, absolutely.
Why does he place so much value on these kinds of international gatherings?
It seems it's less about just passively receiving information and much more about the active exchange, the dialogue. He made a point that, well, okay, the experiences of one country may not be identical to those of another. That doesn't mean you can't learn. He emphasized there's always the possibility to always learn from each other.
Right. Finding lessons even in differences.
Exactly. The value isn't necessarily finding identical situations, but drawing lessons, strategies, insights from different contexts, different challenges faced by others. And he saw this specific conference as unique, precisely because it brought together people from various nations. He explicitly said it provided a platform to exchange ideas and experiences. It was that diverse participation that really elevated its value for him.
That idea of a platform for exchange, that feels key, doesn't it? It implies interaction, a real back and forth you wouldn't get just from reading a paper online or something.
Absolutely. And he gave a really telling example from his own experience when he was presenting his paper there. He mentioned that during his presentation, even though, yeah, some people had different opinions.
Which you'd expect.
Right, of course. But through the interaction, the discussion that happened after, they all learned that we shared common aspects. So that engagement, dealing with different viewpoints, actually ended up revealing these underlying similarities, these shared challenges that maybe weren't obvious just looking at the surface.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he explicitly stated that this kind of discovery, finding common ground through direct interaction, wouldn't have been possible without the conference. It wasn't just about him delivering his ideas, but the sort of co-discovery that happened right there in the room.
So the magic wasn't just in the prepared speeches, but in that spontaneous connection, the dialogue that happened simply because people were physically brought together.
Precisely. And he really underlined the human element, the relational side of this.
Yeah.
He noted that the proximity of the listeners also made the experience more personal and engaging. It wasn't some distant, overly formal thing. He actually found it enriching to sit next to the people I was speaking with and discussing ideas. He felt that physical closeness fostered a deeper level of engagement, a better understanding. He even gave credit to the organizers, saying the event planners did an amazing job in achieving this goal. The goal presumably being to facilitate exactly this kind of meaningful interaction and connection among all these diverse participants.
You know, that perspective is such a powerful reminder, especially now, right? In an era just dominated by Zoom calls and digital communication, it speaks to the unique, maybe even irreplaceable value of physically gathering, sharing space, having those unscripted side-by-side conversations and debates.
Yeah.
There seems to be a depth of connection, a kind of discovery that feels unique to that physical closeness.
And what's fascinating is how he connects that tangible experience, the physical proximity, the direct conversation, to the intellectual outcome. Finding common aspects, shared understanding, even when opinions differ. It suggests the way we interact is really integral to what we learn and achieve together.
It absolutely does. And for you, listening right now, does this perspective on the value of conferences or workshops, any kind of gathering really, but does it resonate with your own experiences?
Yeah.
Learning, collaborating, just exchanging ideas? Does it highlight for you the importance of that in-person interaction, even with all the incredibly convenient digital tools we have? Mr. Ebitu's experience, well, it certainly makes a strong case that something uniquely valuable happens when people are physically together grappling with ideas. Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's move to the core argument Mr. Ebitu presented in his paper at the conference. It sounds like it cuts right to the heart of Africa's current global positioning. Section 2, Africa's third wave geopolitical interests and the illusion of options. His paper was titled Emerging Geopolitical Alliances, Whither Africa. What was the fundamental premise he started with there?
He began by framing the current, really intense global focus on Africa as a major observable trend. He stated it pretty unequivocally.
Yeah.
Africa is presently experiencing a period of renewed global interest. And he was quite specific about where this interest is coming from now. He mentioned that the interest of Western countries, European nations, and even Gulf countries has intensified. So it's not just a passing glance. It's a measurable increase in strategic engagement from multiple global players.
So it's not just a vague general interest, but a targeted increasing engagement from diverse global powers.
Exactly. And to give this current moment some crucial historical context, he outlined what he sees as the 3 distinct waves of significant external interest directed towards the African continent throughout modern history.
Ah, okay. The 3 waves.
Yeah. The first wave, looking back, was that brutal period when European powers decided to colonize and partition Africa. This was, a time of profound external intervention driven by resource extraction, strategic control.
A very clear, painful, and incredibly impactful historical period of external focus. And the second wave.
The second wave, he notes, coincided with the Cold War between Russia and the United States. During that period, Africa became this crucial theater for proxy conflicts, ideological battles, strategic maneuvering between the two superpowers.
Right.
It was a period where African nations often found themselves sort of caught between or leveraged by these competing global giants.
And now, according to Mr. Ebitu, we are firmly in the third wave.
Yes, the third wave is the current period we're discussing, and the defining characteristic of this current wave, in his analysis, is just the sheer breadth of the interest. He says interest is coming from all sides of the globe, from east to west and north to south.
Wow.
He emphasized that all of these powers are now developing strategies on how to engage with Africa.
Yeah.
And to capture the intensity, the multi-directionality of this attention, he used this really striking metaphor. He said, metaphorically, Africa is now wanted from everywhere.
Wanted from everywhere.
Yeah, that image immediately conjures up a sense of the continent being this central point of strategic focus, maybe even competition for global powers.
So, given this intense, multi-directional global interest, which you'd think presents Africa with many potential partners, many opportunities, what is the fundamental question he asks? And how does he challenge the most common, maybe the most intuitive response to it?
Well, the fundamental question he puts before his audience, the core challenge of his paper is, what do we do as Africans and where do we go from here?
Yes.
It's the natural pressing question that arises when you're suddenly wanted from all directions, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
However, he takes a really strong stance against what he sees as the most common, perhaps most comfortable response to this situation. He argues that this prevailing opinion on how Africa should react is fundamentally flawed.
Flawed. Okay. What is that common opinion he's pushing back against? What's the flawed approach in his view?
The common opinion, as he describes it, is basically the idea that African nations should carefully consider which alliances to join and how to best leverage the opportunities presented by these alliances.
Okay, so weigh the options, pick the best partners.
Right. It's the perspective that Africa is now in this position of having multiple powerful suitors, multiple global partners, offering various deals, investment, aid, security partnerships, trade agreements, and the strategic imperative for African nations is just to shrewdly navigate these options. Pick and choose the most advantageous alliances to maximize benefits for the continent or for their individual nations.
And he calls this perspective flawed. This is where his illusion concept comes in, right? How does he explain why having all these apparent options is actually an illusion?
Exactly. This is the critical pivot in his argument. He believes that this perception of having numerous options is an illusion. And the reason he calls it an illusion is because, in his view, African nations are fundamentally not in control of the parameters within which these options are presented. The crucial constraint is that the terms of engagement, the nature of the opportunities, the very rules of the game, they're being set by the external powers, not by Africa itself.
Okay, that distinction is absolutely key. It's not that there aren't different offers on the table. It's that Africa isn't one defining the menu or the prices or the conditions attached to those offers. The whole framework is externally imposed.
Precisely. Your choices are only really genuine options when you have some degree of control over the environment where those choices exist.
Right.
When you don't control the fundamental parameters, the geopolitical landscape, the economic rules, the power dynamics, then the choices presented within that externally defined system, well, they aren't expressions of true independent agency. They're merely responses within a framework dictated by others. And that's why he deems the idea of numerous options an illusion, especially in the absence of internal control.
That completely reframes the situation. So if focusing on evaluating and selecting external alliances is based on a flawed premise because the options are, in a sense, illusory, what does Mr. Ebitu propose should be the actual foundational priority for African nations instead?
His core argument is this powerful call to shift the focus inward. Move away from primarily just responding to external overtures. He emphasizes the absolute non-negotiable need to first take charge of the continent before engaging in discussions about external alliances.
Okay.
This internal consolidation, this taking charge, is presented as the essential prerequisite for any meaningful or beneficial external engagement. He states it very clearly, very forcefully. But unless we are strong internally, we cannot truly benefit from these external engagements.
Internal strength is the essential foundation for meaningful external interaction. That really flips the conventional script, doesn't it? The idea that you gain strength through external alliances.
It does, and he reiterates his central point here, linking it directly back to that illusion concept. It is an illusion to think that we have genuine options when we do not have control over the fundamental conditions that shape those options. The path to genuine options, genuine benefit, lies in building strength and control from within Africa itself.
He also delves into the potential downsides of this external engagement, even when it's presented as opportunities. What does he mean when he talks about the potential destructiveness of these seemingly beneficial interactions?
He argues that these opportunities, precisely because they are framed and presented by external actors who control the parameters, can be destructive in subtle but really significant ways. First, he says they can serve as a powerful distraction.
A distraction? How so?
By focusing African leaders' attention and resources on negotiating and managing all these external deals and alliances, these opportunities can distract us from addressing the critical internal issues that require our immediate attention. All the energy gets directed outward, potentially neglecting the pressing needs within the continent.
So the sort of glittering opportunities outside pull focus away from the fundamental work that needs doing at home.
Exactly. And second, the actual solutions or benefits offered by these external alliances, he argues, often offer solutions that may not be the most beneficial for Africa. They might solve a specific narrow problem, perhaps, but in a way that serves the external power's interests more than Africa's long-term development or sovereignty.
That's a crucial point. Something can look like a benefit or be framed as a solution, but if it ends up creating dependency or distorting priorities or undermining local capacity, it might not actually be beneficial in the long run from an African perspective.
Right. And he gives a specific economic example to illustrate this potential destructiveness: direct foreign investment, or FDI.
Ah, FDI. Usually seen as a good thing, right? Bringing in capital.
Exactly. It's commonly seen as a positive influx of capital, resources, technology, maybe jobs.
Yeah.
And it's seemingly beneficial, as he puts it. But he argues it can hinder the growth of local businesses.
Okay, let's really unpack that specific example based on his argument about controlling parameters. How exactly does he suggest foreign investment, which, brings capital, maybe technology, potentially jobs? How can that actually hinder local businesses?
Well, based on his overall argument about external powers setting the terms, the implication is that this foreign investment often operates under conditions that inherently disadvantage local African enterprises.
How so?
For instance, large foreign corporations might arrive with massive capital reserves, advanced technology, maybe established access to global markets or supply chains that local businesses just can't possibly match.
Right, the scale difference is huge.
Huge. And maybe they receive preferential tax treatment or regulatory waivers from governments who are eager to attract that foreign capital. Their sheer scale and resources can allow them to dominate local markets, maybe undercut local competitors on price, or even acquire local assets. And this effectively stifles nascent local entrepreneurship. It prevents the organic growth of an independent, robust African private sector.
So it creates a kind of dependency.
Yeah, it creates a form of economic dependency where Africa becomes primarily a market or a source of labor or resources for foreign entities, rather than building its own self-sustaining economic ecosystem powered by its own local businesses. So while capital flows in, the ability of local actors to actually build wealth and control their own economic destiny gets undermined. It's presented as an opportunity, sure, but often on terms that ultimately reinforce external control and hinder internal capacity building.
That elaboration really ties the foreign investment example right back to his central thesis about the illusion of options and the absolute need for internal control. It highlights how even something presented as a straightforward economic benefit can have these really complex, potentially negative implications when the underlying structure of engagement is controlled externally.
It fundamentally challenges the easy assumption that any external engagement is inherently good. The terms, the context, they matter immensely.
So, if these external engagements are potentially distracting, maybe even destructive, without a strong internal base, what are the specific fundamental internal foundations that Mr. Ebitu argues are absolutely necessary before Africa can effectively and beneficially engage with the outside world? What needs to be built first?
He lays out some specific priorities for this essential internal development, this consolidation. The first one he emphasizes is establishing a unified foreign policy that addresses issues concerning Africa on the global stage.
A unified foreign policy.
Yeah, this isn't just about occasional cooperation. It's about developing a cohesive, single voice, a common strategic stance on international matters that affect the entire continent. This would allow Africa to act as a unified bloc with shared interests in global forums and negotiations.
A single coherent diplomatic and strategic approach, rather than, say, 54 individual nations potentially pursuing conflicting agendas.
Exactly. Speaking with one voice gives significantly more weight, more leverage. The second crucial internal step he identifies is developing a unified military force that can contribute to the security and stability of African nations.
A unified military force. That sounds ambitious.
It does, but it speaks to collective security. The idea is Africa taking primary responsibility for addressing conflicts and instability within the continent. This would reduce reliance on external military interventions, which, let's be honest, often come with their own geopolitical objectives and conditions attached. Instead, it would empower African nations to manage their own security architecture. And he's unequivocal about this. These internal foundations, a unified foreign policy and a unified military force, are essential before effectively engaging with the external world.
So it's about building collective political will and collective physical security as the non-negotiable bedrock upon which any external engagement must stand. That really is a fundamental reorientation, isn't it? Away from seeking partners to gain strength towards consolidating internal strength in order to engage as an equal.
It completely redefines the prerequisite for true sovereignty, for beneficial engagement in this multipolar world. It positions internal unity and strength as the absolute #1 priority.
This perspective really does force a different way of looking at global dynamics. For you, listening right now, does this idea that options are only truly real, only truly beneficial, when you control the underlying conditions and possess internal strength, does that resonate? Can you see this principle applying in other areas of life, maybe beyond geopolitics, perhaps in business negotiations, personal relationships, even community organizing? What does Mr. Ebitu's perspective, as captured in this interview, suggest about the vital, maybe causal link between building from within and being able to effectively influence or benefit from the outside world? It certainly makes you think hard about where true agency really originates. Okay, let's move now from this sort of overarching geopolitical and economic analysis to something Mr. Ebitu is clearly passionate about and very active on, according to the source material: Pan-Africanism. Section 3. Pan-Africanism finding strength in shared identity. The interview notes his significant activity across traditional media, social media, discussing this topic. What's the core focus of his message when he talks about Pan-Africanism?
Well, his focus, as he describes it, seems to be a very deliberate choice. He highlights the positive aspects of Pan-Africanism. He's not dwelling on, say, historical grievances or current problems within the movement itself. Instead, he actively emphasizes the shared values and common goals that unite African nations. This feels like a conscious effort to build upon commonalities rather than getting bogged down in the differences.
So he's intentionally steering the conversation towards what connects people across the continent, what common, maybe negative narrative about Pan-Africanism or African unity is he actively pushing back against in these discussions?
He notes that many discussions about unity in Africa tend to dwell on the negative aspects and the divisions that exist. There's often this focus on the challenges to unity, the conflicts, the diverse colonial histories, different political systems, and so on. And a very frequent, often cited argument he encounters is that Africa is simply too heterogeneous. The shared diversity cultures, thousands of languages, ethnicities, historical experiences, current political and economic realities across, 54-plus countries, the diversity is often presented as this insurmountable barrier to any meaningful continent-wide unity.
The argument is basically the differences are just too vast, too deeply ingrained to ever allow for real unity. How does Mr. Ebitu respond directly to that too heterogeneous argument?
He directly challenges that premise, the idea that diversity makes unity impossible, or that the differences somehow outweigh the similarities.
Right.
His response is that by focusing so much on heterogeneity, we often overlook the many similarities that unite us. He acknowledges the diversity exists, of course he does, but he insists there are these deeper commonalities, maybe shared cultural values, shared historical experiences, especially relating to colonialism and its aftermath, shared aspirations for development, for sovereignty that are frequently underestimated or just ignored in these discussions. And to powerfully illustrate his point, to counter that too heterogeneous argument, he provides this comparative example that's actually quite effective at making you reconsider.
What's the comparison he draws?
He asks his audience to consider the European Union.
Oh, okay.
He immediately points out that the EU is decidedly not a homogeneous bloc. I mean, think about it. Germany, France, Italy, Poland, Sweden, Greece. They have vastly different languages, distinct cultures, varied histories, including centuries of conflict between them, different economic models, diverse political traditions. Yet despite this clear, undeniable lack of homogeneity, he notes, they have found ways to unite despite their differences.
That comparison is quite potent, isn't it? If Europe, with its long history of internal conflict and profound cultural and linguistic diversity, can find pathways towards unity, cooperation, free movement of people and goods, why is the narrative about Africa's diversity so often framed as this insurmountable obstacle?
Exactly. He uses that comparison to underscore his assertion about the African continent itself. We Africans also possess more similarities than differences. He's arguing that the focus on the challenges of heterogeneity is often disproportionate, or maybe even strategically emphasized by those who perhaps don't want to see a unified Africa. He believes the shared values, the common historical threads, the collective aspirations for a stronger, more sovereign continent are powerful unifying forces that just deserve more attention, more emphasis.
So, what is the crucial message he's striving to convey through his engagement on Pan-Africanism, navigating this space between acknowledging the real differences but also highlighting these often overlooked similarities?
Well, his core message seems to be a call to action and a shift in perspective. First, the need to recognize these shared values and focus on what binds us together. That's the positive narrative he's championing. Second, while emphasizing that common ground, he stresses the importance of acknowledging the existence of differences. He's not advocating for some forced artificial uniformity or pretending that ethnic or national or historical differences don't exist or haven't caused challenges. He sees them as real elements of the African reality.
So, it's not about trying to erase differences, but finding a practical way for diverse groups and nations to coexist and cooperate.
Precisely. He frames the crucial question for Pan-Africanism today as how to live together despite these differences. That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it? Building unity not by eliminating diversity, but by finding effective mechanisms for peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, collaboration that can transcend national and ethnic lines. And this message, recognizing shared values while actively figuring out practical ways to coexist and collaborate despite differences, that's the core message he tries to disseminate through his various media platforms, especially social media, where these discussions are often quite lively, quite engaged.
It feels like a very pragmatic, forward-looking approach to unity, focusing on the practical challenge of coexisting and cooperating, rather than seeing diversity purely as a stopping point.
And what's fascinating here is the strategic choice he makes, countering that dominant negative narrative about African heterogeneity by providing a powerful, relevant comparison like the EU, and explicitly arguing that the focus needs to shift to the commonalities, yes, but also to the active challenge of coexisting despite the differences. It's a call to action based on possibility, not on perceived impossibility.
And for you, listening now, how does this idea resonate? Actively choosing to focus on shared values, common goals versus dwelling on differences. How does that shape discussions, collaborations, relationships in your own life or work? Can you think of examples, maybe in a team, a community, even within a family, where perceived heterogeneity or past disagreements were overcome by finding common ground, by deliberately focusing on what binds people together and figuring out how to coexist? Mr. Ebitu's point, reinforced by his EU example, strongly suggests that where you choose to place your focus fundamentally changes what becomes achievable. Okay, let's move now to the fourth section. This builds directly on the idea of communication, influence, the platforms through which ideas get shared, narrative warfare, and the power of media. Given Mr. Ebitu's significant activity on social media, it's natural the interview touches on the role of these platforms. Can social media, despite its limitations, actually be a tool for uniting Africans, according to him?
He offers a nuanced answer here. He starts with a qualified yes, acknowledging the potential for social media to connect people across the continent. It certainly does that. However, he immediately, and importantly, adds that it's important to acknowledge the limitations of these platforms when you're considering them as tools for something as fundamental as continental unity or, say, a communication strategy.
What are the key limitations he identifies when it comes to relying on social media platforms for something so crucial?
The primary limitation he points out is that these platforms, while very widely used in Africa, are fundamentally not entirely within our control.
Right. Owned elsewhere.
Exactly. He highlights the vulnerability this creates, stating flatly that they can be shut down or manipulated by the external entities, usually corporations, that own and operate them. This lack of sovereignty over the communication infrastructure itself is a significant strategic concern for him.
That's a critical vulnerability, isn't it? Even if they facilitate communication among Africans, the ultimate power switch, the control panel, is held somewhere else.
Precisely. You're essentially building on ground that isn't entirely yours, and it can be pulled out from under you at any moment.
Yeah.
However, he doesn't just dismiss the platforms entirely. He definitely acknowledges their undeniable positive impact on bringing people closer, facilitating expression. He also notes the significant ongoing shift in the broader media landscape. He observes that traditional media like radio and newspapers are declining in influence in many areas across the continent. And in contrast, social media has emerged as a powerful voice, allowing individuals to express themselves freely,
Hmm.
often bypassing traditional gatekeepers to some extent.
So it's a powerful, widely used tool for connection and expression right now, kind of filling a void left by traditional media. But it comes with these inherent strategic risks because of that external control. Now, this discussion leads into that truly powerful and central concept he introduced in the interview: narrative warfare. This is the idea we touched on right at the very beginning. What does Mr. Ebitu mean by narrative warfare?
This is where he really articulates his view of the fundamental nature of global competition in the modern era. He states it very clearly, very starkly. The world today operates on the principle of narrative warfare.
Wow.
In his view, narratives aren't just incidental stories or different perspectives on events. They are active instruments, strategic weapons deployed in this constant global struggle for influence, for power, for control.
Narrative warfare as the governing principle of today's world. And he says it's the absolutely primary battlefield, like before anything else.
Yes, he emphasizes its primacy, above even physical or economic action in the sequence of events. He argues quite forcefully that before any physical action takes place, the narrative battle must be won.
Must be won.
Yeah. According to Mr. Ebitu, shaping perceptions, controlling the information environment, winning the story, this is a necessary precursor to achieving significant real-world objectives. This is how the world functions now, he states, really underscoring its fundamental importance in contemporary global affairs.
And he provided that really striking example to drive this point home, didn't he?
He did. He used a very direct, maybe even dramatic example. Before attempting a coup, for example, he explained, you must first win the support of others through narrative manipulation.
Okay.
This example really illustrates how controlling the story, creating a justification, mobilizing support through carefully crafted narratives is seen as a prerequisite step before you even attempt a physical takeover of power. It's about establishing a narrative framework that makes the subsequent physical action possible, or acceptable, or maybe even desirable in the eyes of key actors or populations.
That is a sobering perspective. The idea that the information war isn't just some parallel activity, but often the essential first step that enables physical or political actions. So applying this concept of narrative warfare, which is clearly being waged globally, how does Mr. Ebitu believe Africa can effectively counter negative, biased, or harmful external narratives about itself? What concrete steps does he suggest are necessary?
Well, he first addresses a potential, but in his view, dangerous idea for countering external narratives, trying to limit the flow of information to your own people. He explicitly deems this a dangerous approach.
Why dangerous? Why is restricting information to your own population a bad idea, in his view?
He links it directly to the principles of governance. He believes that good governance relies on trusting one's people to make informed decisions. Restricting their access to information, even if the intention is to protect them from external influence, ultimately undermines that fundamental trust between the government and the governed.
Okay.
However, he immediately balances this. While trust is key, he states it is equally important to protect them from misinformation and manipulation. So the goal isn't censorship. It's about building resilience, providing accurate information, and actively countering deliberate campaigns of falsehoods or distortion that might originate externally.
Okay, so limiting information isn't the answer because it erodes trust, hinders informed decision-making. But protecting people from manipulation is necessary. How does Africa actively achieve that protection and counter external narratives effectively within this framework of narrative warfare?
He's quite specific about the strategic imperative here. He argues that a crucial, perhaps the most crucial step for Africa is to establish strong media houses and communication channels that prioritize African interests.
Build your own platforms.
Exactly. This is his proposed strategic response to being on the receiving end of external narrative warfare. You simply cannot effectively counter a narrative if you don't have your own powerful platforms to tell your own story from your own perspective with your own priorities.
Why is establishing Africa's own strong media platform so critical right now? What's the current media landscape he observes in Africa?
He points to the overwhelming dominance of external media outlets within Africa itself. He states it quite matter-of-factly. Currently, Western media dominates the African media landscape. Yeah. And he highlights the sheer reach, the penetration of these outlets, noting that their channels are readily available even in remote villages across the continent. This isn't just about international news reaching Africa. It's about a pervasive presence deep within African societies themselves.
Available everywhere.
Yeah.
That's a powerful and potentially incredibly influential presence that goes way beyond just simple news consumption, surely.
And he doesn't interpret this widespread presence as accidental or purely driven by market forces. He views it strategically.
Yep.
He states that this widespread presence is a deliberate strategy to exert cultural influence.
Wow. A deliberate strategy.
That's his analysis. The continuous, easily accessible flow of content from external media isn't just about providing news or entertainment. In his view, it's a conscious, strategic effort to shape perspectives, influence values, frame the understanding of events, and project specific cultural norms within African populations. It's a form of soft power, exerted through informational dominance.
So, the challenge isn't just countering specific false stories here and there, but addressing this fundamental imbalance in the information ecosystem itself, where external voices have such pervasive reach and influence, and maybe deliberately shaping the narrative environment.
Precisely. The battlefield is the information space itself, and the current layout, according to him, heavily favors external players.
Okay, given this significant challenge, external media dominance possibly being used as a deliberate strategy for cultural influence, how does he see leveraging existing tools, like social media, fitting into the strategy? He mentioned it earlier as a tool for connection.
He acknowledges that this existing dominance presents a significant challenge for Africa. It's a reality. However, he suggests that while Africa works towards building its own robust media infrastructure, which takes time, resources, we can leverage the tools available to us, such as social media, precisely because they have become so widely used and have emerged as these powerful channels for individuals and groups to communicate, organize, maybe bypass traditional media entirely sometimes. So they can be useful tactical tools for disseminating alternative narratives or connecting people in the short term.
But leveraging external social media platforms, that's not the ultimate strategic solution in his view.
No, he frames it very much as a necessary but interim measure. He states the ultimate long-term goal very clearly and ties it right back to countering the dominance of external media to build our own strong media platforms and counter these narratives. The strategic objective is not perpetual reliance on platforms controlled by external powers. It's developing indigenous, Africa-owned and controlled media infrastructure. Television networks, radio stations, online platforms, news agencies that can effectively collect and disseminate information, tell African stories from African perspectives, and actively challenge and counter harmful, biased, or manipulative narratives originating from outside the continent.
That's a very strategic, very long-term view. It directly addresses the current imbalance in the information space, recognizes narrative warfare as a core global dynamic, and argues that controlling one's own story through one's own platforms is an essential element of sovereignty in the 21st century.
And what's truly fascinating here is how he integrates that concept of narrative warfare directly into the discussion of media presence and control. It connects the abstract idea of competing narratives to the very tangible reality of who owns the TV station or the social media platform. It highlights that infrastructure and ownership are just as crucial as the messages themselves in this global battle for influence.
And for you listening now, Mr. Ebitu's perspective on narrative warfare, that idea that the story must be won before the action can begin, it's incredibly thought-provoking, isn't it? When you consume information daily, whether it's news about Africa, international events, even domestic issues, how aware are you of this concept in action? How might the idea, as he suggests, that there's often a deliberate strategy to exert cultural influence through media presence, how might that fundamentally change how you view and interpret global information flows? What responsibility does understanding this dynamic place on you as a consumer, and perhaps even a sharer of information in today's really complex world of narrative warfare? Finally, let's wrap up by touching on a brief personal reflection Mr. Ebitu shared right at the very end of the interview about his visit to Eritrea for the conference. Section 5, Reflections on Peace and Place.
Yeah, after delving into such intense geopolitical and strategic topics, he did conclude with a personal note. He wrapped up by describing his experience in Eritrea overall as a truly valuable experience. He mentioned it was his first time visiting Eritrea, and he emphasized that he thoroughly enjoyed his time there.
Was there anything specific about the place itself that left an impression on him beyond the conference?
Yes, he highlighted a specific feeling, an atmosphere he experienced there. He specifically appreciated the peace and tranquility he felt during his stay in Eritrea.
Peace and tranquility.
Yeah. And to give context to why this stood out to him, he added a comparative note. He said, "This sense of peace and tranquility is something I rarely encounter in other cities that he visits." He also just reiterated his enjoyment of the conference itself, which was, of course, the reason for his visit.
That's a lovely kind of grounding personal reflection, isn't it? Especially after we've spent our time diving into these really complex, somewhat quite heavy topics: geopolitical competition, the struggle for sovereignty, the strategic battle for narratives.
Mm.
It's interesting how, amidst the analysis of these vast, powerful forces playing out on the global stage, he finds a moment to appreciate something as fundamental as personal peace, tranquility, just on the ground level. It perhaps serves as a subtle reminder of the human experience, the individual lives, the local realities that exist beneath these larger, abstract, strategic dynamics.
It provides a tangible counterpoint, doesn't it? A moment of calm reflection against the backdrop of the intense, often turbulent global forces he was just analyzing.
So we've reached the conclusion of our deep dive into this incredibly insightful interview with Mr. Larmbert Ebitu, published on Shabait and conducted by Sabrina Solomon.
And we've really worked through the source material you provided, extracting some truly key insights, I think. We began with his reflections on the ICES 2025 conference, didn't we? Highlighting the profound value he found in physical gathering, diverse participation, and that dynamic interaction that reveals shared challenges, common ground.
Yeah, then we dove deep into his central, really challenging argument about Africa's third wave of global interest, exploring his perspective that the apparent options for external alliances are ultimately an illusion unless Africa first builds that strong, unified internal base controlling the parameters of engagement.
Following that, we examined his views on Pan-Africanism, focused on his deliberate emphasis on shared values, common goals, and how he directly counters that too heterogeneous argument by highlighting the need to learn how to live together despite differences, drawing inspiration from examples like the European Union.
And finally, we spent significant time unpacking his sharp analysis of narrative warfare, understanding it as that absolutely critical prerequisite battle that must be won before physical action can succeed, which led directly to his compelling argument for Africa to counter pervasive external influence, strategic cultural exertion, by establishing its own strong media platforms to tell its own story.
The overarching central takeaway from Mr. Ebitu's analysis, as presented in this interview from Shabait, really feels like a powerful, inward-focused call to action for African nations. It's a call to prioritize building robust internal foundations politically, militarily, economically, and crucially, informationally, as the essential prerequisite for genuinely benefiting from, rather than just being shaped by, the changing global landscape. It's a strategic argument for internal consolidation as the true path to meaningful external engagement and authentic sovereignty in this multipolar world.
This has been a deep dive into the specific source material you provided, and we truly hope it's given you a clearer, maybe more layered understanding of these complex and vital issues facing Africa in the global arena today. We strongly encourage you to continue thinking about the significant implications of the ideas Mr. Ebitu shared.
And maybe let's leave you with this final provocative thought to carry forward to consider. Given Mr. Ebitu's perspective on narrative warfare, that assertion that the story must be won before any significant action can truly succeed, and his analysis of the strategic use of media to exert cultural influence, how does consciously understanding who is telling the story fundamentally change how you interpret events and information, whether they relate to Africa or any other part of the world? And what responsibility does that critical understanding place on you as a consumer and maybe participant in today's global information environment?
A lot to ponder, for sure. Thank you for providing the source materials that allowed us to take this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable and enriching. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.